Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. The East St. Louis public housing system has been troubled for years. In 1985, HUD took receivership of a substandard system. Longtime residents say things did not improve over time, that physical deterioration, health, and security issues re-emerged. Last September, HUD returned control to the East St. Louis Housing Authority, even though inspectors had found numerous ongoing violations that may have even contributed to the murder of a resident. Many residents want out. What now? This story is detailed in the Southern Illinoisan newspaper in a story by reporter Molly Parker. She joins us by phone from New York City. In studio is St. Louis Public Radio Sharing America reporter Ashley Lisenby. She did a companion piece for us here. They are reporting as part of the ProPublica Local Reporting Network. Ladies, thanks so much for being with us. Great to have you.
Thanks, Don.
Molly, let me begin with you. It's hard to believe that this situation in public housing in East St. Louis has been going on for so very long.
Yeah, that's right. It is something that has many, many years been an issue for residents. I understand that a lot of the longtime residents told me things got a little better when HUD took over at first, but like many old housing complexes across the country that have been cash-starved for repairs, it's not surprising to see buildings built in the 40s and 50s suffering again.
Well, that cash situation doesn't seem likely to get much better soon.
That's right. This administration has actually proposed zeroing out or completely eliminating the funding for capital repairs, which is those that pay for major system repairs like new roofs and HVAC systems, things that these old buildings desperately need. And Congress has so far sort of bucked some of those requests of the administration, but moving into the next few fiscal years, there's a lot of uncertainty for housing authorities.
Why would HUD have decided last year to reinstate the East St. Louis Housing Authority?
I suppose that's $1 million question. I think there is this belief within people who follow public housing, or that, HUD should, if they just, inspected the properties better, and if they came in and took control of housing authorities, what they put them in what they call receivership, that they have some sort of magic ability to correct problems. I think what we're finding is that you can't inspect your way out of this problem, and you can't take over your way out of this problem. The folks that come in on HUD, they do offer sometimes some additional expertise, but they have no more resources at hand oftentimes to address the problems that brought them there in the first place. And without sort of a wholesale rethinking of what are we going to do about these older buildings in areas, in some communities that have strong economies, there has been some success at public-private partnerships. But even that, hasn't solved the affordable housing shortage in our country, even in fast-growing cities. But particularly in economically struggling cities, the ability to, replace what's lost financially with private investment is even harder.
Well, I asked that question because when the housing secretary came in last September to reinstate, his own inspectors had indicated that there were numerous violations that still hadn't been corrected. And, in fact, he didn't even bother to visit any of the projects while he was here.
They had the event. I was at the event. It was, definitely a positive event. I know for the city, they looked at, being able to put this back under their control as a very positive thing for the city. And, again, in some ways, one might argue, well, what if HUD wasn't going to do anything more? Perhaps it is time for city leadership to try to do what they can. There were still folks, involved at the city level and the local level working for the housing authority. It wasn't like all these HUD employees were down here from Washington. I think that's a misconception that they were down here like physically running it 24/7, but it was under HUD control. But I think it poses this larger question of like, as we see certain communities that have lost funding and aren't able to replace funding and have these old unsafe buildings, you could say, well, HUD should come in and take them over. But I think East St. Louis shows that HUD doesn't necessarily have solutions for addressing the unsafe conditions either. So again, you can't receivership or inspect your way out of the problem. There has to be some more creative solutions to address these conditions. And I don't think anyone would argue that like children, should be living in conditions that are just inherently unsafe, where we have mold, lead paint, et cetera. It's not about, looking down on any one particular community. It's just about a matter of having the resources to address and just make sure that these conditions are decent, safe, and sanitary as the law requires. That is a legal mandate. It is not true that public housing is just, I think sometimes it's just written off as, well, it's all bad. And that's just simply not true.
I should point out, by the way, that we invited representatives from the city of East St. Louis and from the Housing Authority to be a part of this program, and they declined to do so. Let me turn now to Ashley Lisenby. Ashley, little wonder that a lot of people want to get out of that public housing area over in East St. Louis. What are you finding?
Exactly. I went over to a woman's unit over in the John Robinson Homes where Molly investigated conditions there. And this one woman's apartment or home, rather, was falling apart. She had complained about several issues in her bathroom, the door being off the hinges, no running water in her bathroom sink, her tub leaking down into her kitchen, creating lots of problems, including mold for her family and her kids. So when we talked, she said she was interested in moving, obviously, considering the conditions. But over the last 3 years, has not been eligible or hasn't received Section 8 vouchers, the housing choice voucher, that would help her to move into a private market rate apartment. I think we ought to explain how that works, because these are vouchers that are obtained not from East St. Louis, but from the county. Yeah, exactly. So from St. Clair County Housing Authority. And so they have a long list of folks who are looking for these housing choice vouchers. 7,000? 7,000 people. And that's not uncommon. In St. Louis County, there are about 11,000 applicants on that housing choice voucher list. And that's information I received back in May when I was covering a different story. And I talked to the executive director there. So it's not an uncommon thing to find, but it is very frustrating for the applicants who are unsure how the process works. In St. Clair County, they have a preferential point system where they give priority to veterans, to the elderly, to people who are homeless, those who have been displaced because of natural disasters, all things that are reasonable to consider. But it kind of leaves an interesting gray area for people who are single or have children and are working and may not ever get to the top of that wait list. And if there are 7,000 of these people, I mean, it's hard to imagine there are 7,000 properties readily available at any given time to house them. Exactly, right. Yeah. So it's that problem of demand and what's available. And so the demand in St. Clair County is very high, but the availability is not. And so that also creates another layer to this problem. Molly, coming back to you, the conditions that Ashley has just described are exactly the sort of things that you were looking at. But you're looking at public housing elsewhere, too, as I understand it. Is this so terribly unique here in East St. Louis? Absolutely not. There are communities that struggle more than others with their housing stock, and often it has to do with the fact that the housing in those communities is just extremely old, and some of that may be historical about the way these communities looked 100 years ago. So you have places like East St. Louis and even, Gary, Indiana is another example of a housing authority in receivership. Well, these were fast-growing, booming industrial cities. So part of this, not holistically across the country, but part of this becomes an issue of this housing went up during a time of large population growth, and it was mainly housing for workers. And as the decades have gone by, as we know about East St. Louis and some other communities, for a variety of reasons, a changing economy, racism is part of it. We've had the middle class has left. The population has changed dramatically and is much, much smaller, but you still have a large housing stock. Now, East St. Louis has downsized somewhat over the years, but you still have a large percent of the population relying on the housing. And again, where you have a different equation in fast-growing cities that also have a terrible affordable housing crisis and crunch, they are at least able to tap into a bit of private market, housing to rebuild. Obviously, Illinois, looking at
HUD is one thing. I think the state of Illinois is also going to have to start to have this conversation. Where do we have these housing shortages, not just with public housing, but inadequate private market housing that's not subsidized? Many of our communities have these issues, and they're more difficult to deal with when you're in stagnant or declining economic conditions, which is not an East St. Louis specific problem. Obviously, it's very much on display there, but you can look across the whole Southern Illinois region and see community after community struggling with these problems. East St. Louis's public housing problem is particular to the fact that their buildings are also extremely old, built in the early 1940s, some of them.
I should point out that later on in this program, we're going to be talking with a member of our We Live Here team because they're dealing with an eviction case. Their focus is on housing during this season. And we'll be talking about an eviction case which has gone all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court. And it reflects the kind of conditions that you're talking about, not in public housing, but in inferior housing in St. Louis. I have to take a break. Let's do that now. We'll come back and continue our conversation on the public housing situation in East St. Louis. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Thank you for listening to this St. Louis on the Air podcast supported by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome back to our conversation about the public housing situation in East St. Louis. My conversation is with Molly Parker, a reporter with the Southern Illinoisan. She's talking to us from New York City. And we have St. Louis Public Radio reporter Ashley Lisenby with us in studio. Ashley, let me turn to you. Molly mentioned something about racism possibly being a factor in all of this. How do you look at that? Oftentimes people who live in these communities are invisible to the rest of the community.
Right. It is disproportionately folks who identify as Black or African American who live in the housing project that I visited, the John Robinson homes. And the woman I met, she made a comment about that. She said she felt that she wasn't being seen, and she felt that had a lot to do with not only her race but her socioeconomic status, being low income. And that is an age-old story, an age-old problem, how officials and just other people who live in a community see folks who live in the projects and can be very degrading to the folks who live there.
How do you see it, Molly? You mentioned it, but are you seeing the same thing in the other places you've visited and stories you've read?
I mean, I think it's an undeniable part of the equation that, again, both people of color and also just generally people of low income are, feel like they're left out of the conversation oftentimes. I mean, even when you look at, what to do in a situation like East St. Louis, and again, not just East St. Louis, but other communities that are in a similar situation, there's such a tough thing because there unfortunately are no easy answers, and often the answers are painful on both ends. I mean, do you shut housing down and issue these vouchers that Ashley's reporting on? I mean, some people want to leave East St. Louis, but it's also true that many people want to stay in their home community. The options are always talked about as helping people move elsewhere, but you don't hear enough about the conversation about helping people move in and helping rebuild. You hear it within the city, but you don't hear it much, unless the political leaders are forced to talk about it within the state and our country, because these are tough situations. They just choose to look the other way, I believe, a lot of times. And I couldn't say it better than Ashley did, but I hear that a lot as well when I visit East St. Louis and other places across the country and talk to people who rely on subsidized housing. They feel like they're stigmatized and forgotten. Often people will note to me like that people think public and housing don't work and don't pay rent, and neither of those things are true. Often people are working sometimes multiple jobs, and they are paying 30% of their income, like most of us, toward their housing.
In reading your story, and I think I got this from your story, it was suggested that perhaps HUD is disassociating itself from the situation to avoid these kinds of problems. Does that sound right to you? Is that something that you wrote?
That was a comment the state's attorney made, that he felt like that they were distancing themselves from the problem by turning it over to local officials who many people talk very highly of the housing authority director and the mayor and their abilities and their desires to turn around East St. Louis, but that if you hand them something with no solutions or very few solutions, or solutions that are unrealistic in a short amount of time and enough time to address conditions that are happening now and are very unsafe, what are you handing them? Are you just setting them up to fail? And I know they have plans, and I know that they are working toward rebuilding, as are many communities. But I think these conversations need to be elevated to another platform to realize that this is not just happening in one particular community, and you can't just fault a particular community. That this is a nationwide problem, and that public housing can and often is very, very safe. And that where it's not, that there needs to be solutions to address it.
Ashley, how would you assess St. Clair County's willingness to deal with this voucher problem?
Sure. The executive director there seems very willing. The desire is there. I think it comes down to the housing stock. What are the resources? Is that readily available for families who are interested in moving into private housing? So another woman I spoke with, Arthea, is in her 50s, her late 50s, and kind of returning back to this issue of socioeconomic status and race, and the combination of those two things. She's been living in public housing for over 30 years and has been waiting for a Section 8 voucher for over 30 years. But now she's considering subsidized senior housing as an option, but has to go through a similar process. But
is this something that would cost the county money in any sense of the word?
Well, the funding for these vouchers is combined, right? It's local money, it's federal money that goes into giving families Section 8 vouchers. So, yes, but like with all subsidized programs, it's a combination of funds coming from different places.
It's been indicated that Congress doesn't have the appetite for spending much more money, if any more money, on this situation.
Sure.
I wonder about signals from the top in this administration, whether there's any reason to believe that the Trump administration would like to reverse that.
I don't know how much authority I have to speak on that. Maybe Molly knows more about it than I do. But my gut reaction would be no.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that way. Molly, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, what you hear out of this administration from Ben Carson, who is the Trump administration's appointee to run HUD, is that they are doing some things toward, really encouraging private investment and privatization. I won't say it's that there aren't any creative solutions coming out of the administration, but they do seem to largely be sitting on the sidelines. And if you're in a community that doesn't have the ability to utilize some of these tools that they're putting forth that really rely heavily, even more so, on privatization, that you're left out of the equation. The communities that we're talking about, not just East St. Louis, but across Southern Illinois and parts of St. Louis and others of us in this Midwest industrial Rust Belt are not part of some of those discussions.
I alluded to it in the introduction to our conversation here, to the fact that you are tying, in a sense, a murder in the East St. Louis Public Housing Unit to the situation there. Very quickly, give us that story, if you would.
Well, and to be clear, we're not saying that we're being. The conversation about that was very particular to the security of the unit and to the fact that the homicide that occurred at the John Robinson homes, police said that the intruder entered through a window, and that the parent, the mother of Alexis Winston, a young tenant there with her child, she was killed in front of her baby, that they broke in through that window after she had asked for, weeks for there to be, first off, it didn't lock, but then it also was missing a flat security screen that is commonly seen on others throughout the complex.
We have a caller from East St. Louis. Our time is winding down, but let's bring in David. David, thanks for waiting. You're on the air.
Well, I simply want to say that the housing situation in East St. Louis is compounded by the discriminatory practice that HUD itself put in existence. I was a property owner in East St. Louis who accepted Section 8 vouchers, and they redlined. They would only pay us a certain price, no matter how well in comparison to other communities our properties were, and they simply discriminated. It didn't matter the fact that, for example, I had a 4-bedroom house, air-conditioned, well-insulated. They would only pay me $600 for a 4-bedroom unit, whereas someone actually moved to Washington Park to a white owner, and they paid them $800 for a 4-bedroom, and 2 of the rooms were in the basement, makeshift.
David, we have the point. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because of our time consideration, I want to get Ashley to react to that. Is that something you've been seeing and hearing as well?
Sure. I guess that's the other side of this story on housing vouchers, right? This one side that I've covered is about getting access to them. The other side is, well, where are people going once they already have them? And Molly touched on it a little bit, but this idea of sending people to quote unquote high opportunity areas, that's coded language, honestly, for sending them outside of their immediate communities. And this man's experience, I haven't reported on it, but there very well might be something there.
Right. Our time winding down, Molly. Where do we go from here, from your perspective?
Well, I wish I knew those answers. I wouldn't even begin to believe that I could solve the housing crisis in East St. Louis or elsewhere. But I think that bringing more, of course, our role as journalists, bring more light to these issues, like the caller was talking about. I think those are things that we should be looking into in East St. Louis and other communities. I think that there is very much validity to what he's talking about, handing people vouchers and just saying, well, good luck isn't the answer either. There has to be some mix of solutions here. And I think this, not just the federal government, I think our state needs to step up to the plate and start talking about this a little bit more in Illinois as well.
Ashley, where do we go from here, from your perspective?
I think I'm just as at a loss as Molly on where this goes next. But I think there are lots of conversations in our region about how to provide more affordable housing, and that's on both ends for people who are in public housing and also for private housing.
You've both made it very clear that that is definitely necessary. No question about that.
That's where it's going.
I want to thank you, Molly Parker from the Southern Illinoisan, for being with us. Great to talk to you. And Ashley, thank you for being with us as well.
Thank you so much.
This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.